In the fog-drenched settlement of Blackpoint, Maine, a young woman clutching rusted keys was about to cross a condemned bridge that everyone warned her to avoid. What started as settling a grandfather's estate took a shocking turn when she came face to face with a lighthouse that had been dark for 40 years, but was still sending signals into the night. Nora Whitfield wasn't your typical heir to a cursed property. For her entire life she had carried questions about a grandfather who vanished in 1953, a family that refused to speak his name, and a maritime disaster that killed 37 souls. Known for her quiet determination and refusal to accept comfortable lies, she had finally inherited the one thing that could give her answers, a sealed lighthouse on Blackpoint Cliffs. When she heard the Morse code pattern ... cycling endlessly through the fog, she had no idea she was walking into a conspiracy that had poisoned an entire town for generations. Nora began climbing the narrow spiral stairs of the abandoned tower, each level revealing another piece of her grandfather's desperate attempt to expose the truth. Her investigation would uncover hidden tape recordings, a man who had been erased from existence, and a smuggling operation that turned a storm into mass murder. What began as an inheritance of property would become an inheritance of responsibility. The coastal town of Blackpoint would never be the same after the lighthouse finally spoke its truth, and the dead were given voices that could no longer be silenced by the living. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Nora Whitfield had never trusted bridges that swayed under, but there she stood, one duffel bag, and a manila folder of legal papers weighing her down as the narrow wooden span to Blackpoint Cliffs creaked with each careful step. The planks were half-rotted, gaps wide enough to see the surf churning 40 feet below against jagged rock. Gulls circled overhead like sentries, their cries sharp and accusing in the salt wind. The lighthouse rose at the far end, a weathered tower of grey stone streaked with rust from its iron fittings. It looked smaller than she had imagined from the photographs, hunched against the Atlantic sky as if trying to disappear into the fog that clung to everything here. The lantern room at the top was dark, sealed behind metal plating that caught the weak afternoon light. She made it across the bridge without incident, though her hands were shaking by the time she reached solid ground. The keys to the lighthouse were in her coat pocket, two of them on a ring so rusted they had fused partly together. The door itself was chained twice, once with an official padlock stamped with the Coast Guard seal, and once with a heavy personal lock that had no marking at all. Someone had wanted this place very closed. Nora had come to Blackpoint with questions she had carried since childhood. Her grandfather, Captain Elias Whitfield, had vanished from this lighthouse in 1953 during a storm, presumed dead or mad, the stories never quite agreeing on which. Her mother had refused to speak of him except in vague, pained fragments. A good man who went bad, a keeper who lost his way. The inheritance papers that arrived 3 weeks ago had been the first concrete proof. Nora ever held that Elias Whitfield had existed at all, beyond family whispers. The settlement of Blackpoint was a mile inland from the lighthouse, a cluster of weather-beaten houses and salt-stained storefronts clinging to the Maine coast like barnacles. Nora checked into the only inn, a narrow Victorian, with peeling paint and windows that rattled in their frames. The woman at the desk, Mrs. Carver, took her information with tight-lipped efficiency and did not ask why she had come. But that night in the dining room, the whispers started. Nora sat alone at a corner table, picking at fish chowder that tasted of old metal, and heard the conversations eddy around her like tide pools. The Whitfield light sometimes blinks even now, decommissioned in 53. After the wreck, after Elias went dark, they say the mechanism was removed. But I've seen it from the harbour, a flicker on storm nights. The Sea Haven went down because of him. 37 souls. Or maybe 37 souls because of what they were carrying. Nora kept her head down and listened. This was a town that kept its stories close, trading them only among itself. She was an outsider, marked by her grandfather's name and the fact that she had dared to come back. The next morning, she found the town archives in the basement of the municipal building, a cramped space that smelled of mildew and old paper. The curator was a woman named Margaret Holt, Maggie to everyone, with kind eyes and salt and pepper hair pulled back in a loose bun. She greeted Nora warmly, too warmly, as if she had been expecting her. Maggie showed her to a table and brought out files on the lighthouse's history, carefully curated folders with typed summaries and photocopied documents. The beacon had been established in 1889, upgraded in 1920, and officially decommissioned in June of 1953, following the wreck of the cargo vessel Sea Haven and the disappearance of its keeper. The beacon mechanism had been removed for safety reasons, Maggie explained, her voice smooth and practiced. The tower was considered structurally unsound and had been sealed ever since. Nora asked about the keeper's logbooks, particularly for the years 1952 and 1953. Maggie's smile tightened just slightly. Those particular logs were missing, she said, likely lost during the transition, when the Coast Guard handed the property back to the town. There had been an inquest after the wreck, but the findings were sealed as part of the estate settlement. Very tragic, really. Elias had been showing signs of instability in his final months. Some said he deliberately sabotaged the beacon to cause the wreck, though no one could prove intent. Nora pressed for more details. What had the Sea Haven been carrying? Where were the crew manifests? Were there any survivors? Maggie's answers grew vaguer, her hands fluttering over the papers as if to organize them away from scrutiny. It was all so long ago, she said. The families had moved on. Best to let the dead rest, especially in a place like Blackpoint, where the past had sharp edges. As Nora gathered her notes to leave, Maggie touched her arm gently. "Be careful at the lighthouse," she said. "The bridge is unsafe, especially after dark, and some doors, once opened, are hard to close again." Sheriff Emmett Lang was waiting outside the municipal building when Nora emerged into the grey afternoon. He was a tall man in his 50s, with steel-grey hair and eyes that assessed her with practiced neutrality. He introduced himself with controlled courtesy, his handshake firm but brief. "Welcome to Blackpoint, Miss Whitfield," he said. "I understand you've inherited the old light. I wanted to make sure you know the bridge out there is condemned. We can't have you taking unnecessary risks. Some lights," he added with a smile that did not reach his eyes, "aren't meant to be turned back on." Nora thanked him for his concern and told him she was only here to settle the estate, to see what needed to be done with the property. The sheriff nodded slowly as if weighing her words for truth. "If you need anything," he said, "anything at all, you come find me. We look after our own here, even the ones who left." That night, back in her room at the inn, Nora could not sleep. The wind off the ocean rattled her windows and howled through the eaves. She sat at the small desk with the envelope she had found tucked into the deed papers, the one marked in her grandfather's blocky handwriting. For when the fog is... She had not opened it yet, some instinct telling her to wait, to understand this place first, before she read whatever message Elias had left. Around midnight, the foghorn sounded from somewhere down the coast, a low, mournful tone that seemed to press against the walls, and in the pause that followed, Nora heard something else. A pattern, faint, barely audible beneath the wind. Dot, dot, dash. Dot, dot, dash. Then silence. Then the pattern again, cycling like a heartbeat. She knew Morse code from a summer spent with her father, fixing up an old ham radio. What she was hearing was the beginning of SOS, but it never completed the full sequence. Just those first 3 pulses, over and over, coming from somewhere out in the darkness where the lighthouse stood. Nora pressed her forehead against the cold window glass and stared out toward Blackpoint Cliffs. She could see nothing through the fog, but she felt the signal like a physical presence, an invitation or a warning she could not yet pass. At dawn, she decided she would cross that bridge and open the lighthouse, whatever Maggie's caution or the sheriff's veiled threats. The pattern was still echoing in her head, as she finally fell into uneasy sleep. The lighthouse door resisted at first, the chains so corroded they had to be cut with bolt cutters. Nora borrowed from a hardware store that overcharged her and pretended not to know who she was. The Coast Guard padlock snapped easily enough, but the personal lock, the one with no marking, took longer. When it finally gave way, the door swung inward with a groan that seemed to come from deep within the tower itself. The interior smelled of rust and brine and something else, something mechanical and old, like the inside of a stopped clock. Nora stepped into the base room and let her eyes adjust to the dim light filtering through gaps in the boarded windows. The floor was stone, damp with condensation. A metal spiral staircase wound upward into darkness, each step narrow and treacherous with decades of disuse. She had brought a flashlight, a notebook, and a microcassette recorder to document what she found. The recorder had been her father's, something he used for interviews when he worked as a journalist before the drinking got bad. She clicked it on and spoke quietly into the small microphone, describing the entry, the smell, the way sound seemed to pool and echo in the confines. The climb was steep. The tower was divided into levels, each one a cramped room with a specific function from the lighthouse's operational days. First came the keeper's quarters, a circular space maybe 12 feet across, with the remains of a cot, a small stove and shelves bolted to the curved wall. Nora found a spare logbook wedged behind one of the shelves, earlier than the missing years, filled with her grandfather's precise handwriting. Weather observations, ship sightings, routine maintenance notes. But in the margins, penciled lightly as if Elias had not wanted them to be easily seen, were strings of letters, not words, not sentences, just clusters of consonants and vowels spaced at irregular intervals, some circled, some underlined. They looked like code, or the beginning of one. Next to several entries during storm dates, he had drawn small asterisks and written a single word, verify. The next level was the oil room, though the tanks had long since been emptied and removed. Hooks and brackets remained on the walls like the skeleton of something that had once been vital. Nora's flashlight caught a glint of metal in the corner, and she knelt to examine what looked like a wooden panel, slightly raised from the floor. She pried it up with her fingers, and beneath it, nestled in a hollow, was a small metal box, homemade, with exposed wiring and a crude mechanical relay. The device clicked 3 times as she touched it, paused, then clicked twice. Nora jerked her hand back, her pulse spiking. The relay was still active, still powered by something, still following some pattern programmed into it decades ago. She stared at the box, at the way the contacts opened and closed with patient mechanical precision, and felt the hairs on her arms rise. Higher still was the watchroom, the level just below the sealed lantern chamber. This was where the keeper would have monitored the light, kept vigil through the long nights. The walls here were fitted with narrow windows, most of them cracked or missing glass entirely open to the wind and spray. A wooden chair sat bolted to the floor, facing the ocean. On the small desk beside it, Nora found a tattered tide chart for 1953, the final year her grandfather had been here. Someone had drawn on the chart in pencil, connecting certain dates with looping lines, creating a pattern that made no obvious sense. But at the bottom, written in letters pressed so hard the pencil had torn through the paper in places, was a phrase, "Two liars keep the light." Nora recorded everything, describing each object in detail, noting the location. Her voice sounded strange to her own ears in the enclosed space, flat and careful, as if she were afraid of waking something. The tower felt alive in a way she had not expected, not haunted, but aware, humming with some presence that was mechanical and patient and very old. At the base of the tower, she found something she had missed on the way up. A trap door set into the stone floor, heavy iron with 3 bolts securing it from above. The bolts were rusted, but intact. Someone had sealed this deliberately, locking whatever lay beneath. A thick cable ran from the edge of the trap door, up through a conduit in the wall, disappearing into the floors above. The cable had been cut clean, the copper wire inside exposed and oxidized green. Nora stood over the trapdoor and felt the urge to open it war with a deeper instinct for caution. She did not have the tools with her to remove the bolts, not today, but she took photographs with a disposable camera, the flash stark and unforgiving in the shadows. The trapdoor had a kind of finality to it, a sealed thing that promised answers and consequences in equal measure. That night, back at the inn, she listened to the recordings she had made, her voice describing the relay box, the tide chart, the phrase about two liars, and beneath her words, barely audible but definitely there, was a pattern of sounds from the tower itself, mechanical clicking, the kind the relay box made, but faster. And then, just before the tape ran out, a longer sequence. 3 clicks, pause, 3 clicks, the rest of the SOS signal she had heard through the fog. The lighthouse was still trying to send a message, and somewhere in its mechanical heart, a system her grandfather had built or repurposed was still running, counting down or cycling through, waiting for someone to notice, waiting for someone to translate what it was trying to say. Nora spent the next 3 days gathering the town's version of what had happened in 1953. She moved carefully, asking questions that seemed casual, letting people talk around the subject before circling back to her grandfather and the rest. Blackpoint was the kind of place where information was currency and outsiders were spent before they could buy. The town's oldest dockhand was a man named Ferris, bent and weathered like driftwood, who spent his afternoons mending nets behind the fishermen's cooperative. He remembered the Sea Haven, he told Nora, remembered it was a cargo vessel that ran a regular route between Boston and Halifax. She went down in a storm, he said, his gnarled fingers working the netting without looking. Right on the rocks below the lighthouse, the beacon went dark, just when she needed it most. Some said it was mechanical failure. Some said it was Elias. Nora asked if anyone survived. Ferris paused in his work, his eyes distant. There was talk of one man, he said slowly, a crew member who made it to shore, but he walked into the tide a few years later. Or so they said. Nobody remembered his name anymore, if they ever knew it. Funny how people can just disappear from memory like that, as if they were never real to begin with. At a church basement, where a group of older women gathered weekly to work on a community quilt, Nora found motifs of lighthouses stitched into the fabric, small towers with beams radiating outward like trapped stars. The women were polite but guarded, their needles moving in practiced rhythm. One of them, a widow named Mrs. Talbot, mentioned that her late husband had been on the rescue boats the night of the wreck. He never spoke of what he saw, she said, her voice soft, but he stopped fishing after that. Just stopped. Sometimes silence says more than words. Back at the archives, Maggie greeted Nora with the same careful warmth. She had found something, she said, a misfiled document that might interest her. The inquest summary from 1953, tucked into the wrong folder all these years. How fortunate that Nora's visit had prompted a thorough search. The summary was typed on official letterhead, brief and formal. Captain Elias Whitfield had been displaying signs of mental instability in the months prior to the wreck. Erratic behavior, paranoid accusations, obsessive documentation of routine ship traffic. On the night of the storm, the lighthouse beacon had failed. Investigations suggested possible sabotage, though direct evidence was inconclusive. Given the keeper's state of mind and his subsequent disappearance, the inquest had ruled the case closed. The beacon mechanism was removed as a safety precaution, and the property was to remain sealed pending estate resolution. Nora read the document twice, noting what it said and what it carefully avoided saying. There was no mention of what the Sea Haven had been carrying, no list of the crew, no explanation for why it took 40 years for the estate to be settled. The language was designed to shut doors, not open. She asked Maggie about the municipal ledgers, the records of property transfers and land sales. Surely those would still exist. Maggie hesitated, then brought out a series of heavy-bound volumes covering the night. Nora spent hours with them, tracing deeds and parcels along the shoreline. What she found made her stomach tighten. Whole sections had been redacted with black ink, dates and names obliterated. But the redactions themselves formed a pattern. In the months following the wreck, a series of coastal properties changed hands, transferred to shell companies with names that meant nothing to Nora, but clearly meant something to someone. The timing was too precise to be coincidental. Someone had been consolidating control of the shoreline, and they had done it quietly, systematically in the chaos after the Sea Haven went down. Sheriff Emmett Lang appeared at the archive, just as Nora was photographing one of the ledger pages with her disposable camera. She heard his footsteps on the stairs and looked up to find him in the doorway, his expression pleasant, but his presence filling the small space with unspoken authority. "Doing some research, Miss Whitfield?" he asked. His tone was conversational, but his eyes moved from her to the ledger to the camera in her hands. "Coastal deeds can get messy, you know. Lots of local agreements that don't always make it into official records. Outsiders sometimes misread the history, see patterns where there's just ordinary business." Nora met his gaze and did not look away. "I'm just trying to understand what my grandfather was involved in," she said evenly. "Why a keeper would disappear and a ship would wreck, and 40 years later, nobody wants to talk about it." The sheriff's smile stayed in place, but something shifted behind it. "A calculation being made. The sea keeps its secrets, Miss Whitfield. Always has. And sometimes the living need to keep theirs too. For the good of the community. You understand. For peace." He turned to leave, then paused at the door. "That bridge to the lighthouse," he said, looking back at her. "It's been inspected recently. Structural engineers say it could collapse any day. Wouldn't want you taking unnecessary trips out there after dark. Wouldn't want any accidents." After he left, Maggie busied herself reshelf books, her movements tight and nervous. Nora gathered her notes and the camera and walked back to the inn, aware of how exposed she felt on the main street, how many windows looked down on her, how many eyes might be tracking her movements. That night, she returned to the lighthouse despite Emmett's warning. Or perhaps because of it. She brought tools this time, a pry bar and a wrench set, and crossed the swaying bridge under a sliver moon. Inside the tower, she found the relay box in the oil room, and examined it more carefully. The device was connected to the cut cable that ran down to the sealed trapdoor, but it also had a secondary line that ran up through the walls toward the watchroom. She followed the line and found where it terminated, behind a loose panel near the watchroom window, connected to a crude shutter mechanism jury-rigged over the glass. The mechanism was still functional, still able to throw a weak beam of light through the window when the relay triggered. Not strong enough to guide ships, but bright enough to be seen from the harbor on a dark night. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Nora flipped the relay switches experimentally, trying different combinations. The shutter clicked open and closed in response, the beam stuttering across the water in a pattern she was beginning to recognize. Not random, not mechanical failure, Morse code. Incomplete but deliberate, cycling through the same message over and over. SOS. Then a pause. Then 2 letters she could not quite pass. Then the sequence reset. Her grandfather had built this system before he vanished. He had left it running, powered by some hidden source, programmed to signal across 40 years. The question was not whether someone would hear it. The question was whether someone already had, and what they were willing to do to keep it silent. The nor'easter came in hard 3 nights later, wind shrieking across Blackpoint Cliffs, with enough force to make the lighthouse shudder. Nora was inside the tower when the first heavy raindrops began hammering the stone, each one sharp as thrown gravel. She had spent the day studying the relay system, sketching diagrams, trying to understand the logic her grandfather had built into it. The clicks followed a pattern tied to something external, something she finally traced to faint pencil marks on the inside of the watchroom window frame. Tide marks, she realized. Storm surge heights measured and recorded over years. The relay cycled its message in alignment with the tides, activated by some mechanism she had not yet found, but could feel working through the tower like a pulse. She mapped the clicks to Morse code with growing certainty. SOS was clear enough, but the letters that followed were harder to pass through the mechanical degradation and her own inexperience. SOSC over and over. Every 40 minutes when the tide was right, the pattern reset and began again. SOSCE. 4 letters and a plea, in Elias's old coat, the one she had found hanging in the keeper's quarters. Nora discovered a small pocket sewn into the lining. Inside were 3 cards printed with radio frequencies, call signs, and coordinates that meant nothing to her. And beneath them a brass key no longer than her thumb, stamped with a single word in block letters. She rigged the circuit carefully, using the relay box and the shutter mechanism over the watchroom window. The lantern room itself remained sealed above her, the original beacon long removed, but this crude system could still throw light across the hub. Not bright, not far, but visible to anyone watching. Nora flipped the relay switches and sent a test pattern into the storm. 3 short pulses. A pause. 3 more. The international distress call, simple and unmistakable. She did not expect an answer, not really, but she needed to know if anyone was listening, if the system could still reach beyond these walls. The answer came 15 minutes later from a dark shape beyond the dunes. A distant shack she had barely noticed on her walks through town. 2 quick blinks of light, sharp and deliberate, then nothing. Someone had received her signal. Someone was out there in the storm, watching. Nora's hands were shaking as she shut down the beam. The tower groaned around her, wind finding every crack and gap, filling the space with sound like breath through broken teeth. She gathered her notes and started for the spiral stairs. The lighthouse door rattled violently, the iron hinges straining against the frame. Nora froze 3 steps down, her flashlight beam catching the door as it shuddered inward, held only by the bolt she had thrown from inside. Someone was right to get in, yanking hard against the lock. No knock, no call, just force and intent. She ran back up to the watchroom and yanked the relay leads free, killing the beam instantly. The darkness was total, broken only by her flashlight. Below, the door stopped rattling. She heard footsteps on the stone outside, slow and deliberate, circling the base of the tower. Then nothing. Whoever it was had retreated into the storm, satisfied that the light was gone. Nora waited an hour before crossing the bridge back to town, the rain soaking through her jacket, her mind racing with calculations about who had seen the signal, who had answered it, and who had come to make sure she stopped. The shack sat at the far edge of town, past the last row of houses, where the dunes gave way to marsh grass and tidal pools. Nora found it in daylight, a structure so weathered it seemed part of the landscape, grey wood bleached by salt and sun. No mailbox, no number, no sign that anyone lived there at all. She knocked twice and got no answer. The door was unlocked. Inside, the space was small and meticulously ordered. Nautical charts covered one wall, routes marked in pencil and red ink. A radio set sat on a plywood table, old military surplus, its identifying tags scraped off, and in the corner, a narrow cot with a blanket pulled tight across it, hospital corners still crisp. Nora was examining the charts when she heard the back door open and close softly. She turned to find a man in his 60s standing in the kitchen doorway, lean and wind-burned, holding a fishing knife low at his side. His eyes were pale grey, watchful, calculating distance and threat. She raised her hands slowly. "I saw your signal last night," she said. "The 2 flashes. I'm Nora Whitfield. Elias was my grandfather." The man did not lower the knife immediately. He studied her face as if checking it against some memory, some photograph he had carried in his mind for decades. Then he set the knife on the counter and sagged against the doorframe, something breaking behind his eyes. "Jonas Reed," he said, his voice rough from disuse. "Though I've been going by Jonas Marsh for 38 years, you look like him." Around the eyes, Nora let her hands drop. "You survived the Sea Haven." It was not a question, but Jonas answered anyway. "Barely. There were 2 signals that night, Miss Whitfield. Your grandfather's beacon was flashing a warning pattern, trying to tell us the rocks were closer than we thought, that the storm had shifted the currents. But there was another light, a shore light, steady and strong, guiding us in like it was safe harbor. The captain followed the shore light. We hit the rocks at full speed." He moved to the table and sat heavily, his hands flat against the wood, as if anchoring himself. "I made it to the beach more dead than alive. Elias found me 3 days later, hiding in a cave, half out of my mind. He said I needed to disappear, that they would come looking to make sure no one survived to tell what really happened. He set me up here, brought me supplies, helped me build a new name, and he set up the relay system in case something happened to him." Nora sat across from him, the pieces beginning to align. "The frequency cards," she said, "the timed signals. You were supposed to be listening." Jonas nodded slowly. "Every storm surge, every high tide on certain dates, I was supposed to watch for the pattern. If Elias went dark, if something happened to him, the relay would keep cycling through the message he programmed. Ors, SOSCE. I never could figure out what the last 2 letters meant. I thought maybe the system degraded, lost part of the code." Nora pulled out her notebook and showed him the tide chart, the penciled phrase, "2 liars keep the light." Jonas stared at the words, his face draining of color. "CE," he whispered. "Not letters, numbers. 2 liars. The second source, the shore light that guided us in. Someone on land was complicit. Someone helped wreck the Sea Haven, and Elias found out who, and disappeared before he could prove it." Nora finished. "But he left the evidence somewhere. In the lighthouse. In the sealed room." Jonas looked up at her, fear and something like hope warring in his expression. "The brass key," he said. "That's what you need. Elias told me if anything happened, someone would come with the key. He said the radio room beneath the tower held everything. Names, dates, recordings, proof of the whole conspiracy." Nora pulled the key from her pocket and set it on the table between them. "Then we go together," she said. "Tonight, before Sheriff Lang, or Maggie, or whoever tried my door realizes I'm not going to stop." Jonas hesitated, then nodded once, sharp and decisive, a man who had been hiding for nearly 40 years, finally choosing to stand. "If we do this," he said quietly, "we don't stop halfway. We open everything, and we make sure the whole town hears what's down there." They worked through the following day like archaeologists excavating a crime scene. Nora and Jonas moving between the archives and the lighthouse, cross-referencing dates and testing the relay system's timing. Maggie appeared at noon with a new offering, her smile as warm and false as ever. "I found the maintenance log," she announced, setting a leather-bound journal on the table before Nora. "The one that was supposed to be missing. It was misfiled with the harbor master's records. Someone must have mixed up the filing system decades ago." Nora opened the log carefully, scanning the entries. They were too clean, the handwriting too consistent across months and years. Real logbooks, accumulated coffee stains, weather damage, the entropy of daily use. This one looked preserved, deliberate. She noticed the grease smudges on certain pages were drawn in pencil, artificial aging applied by someone who did not understand how lighthouse keepers actually worked. "Thank you, Maggie," Nora said evenly, not looking up. "This will be very helpful." After the curator left, Jonas examined the log and laughed bitterly. "She doesn't think you'll notice, or she doesn't care. Either way, she's offering you a version of history and hoping you take it, Back at the lighthouse, they studied the frequency cards Nora had found. Jonas spread them out on the watchroom floor and traced the patterns with his finger. "These dates," he said. "These aren't random. They align with court sessions in Portland, property disputes, estate hearings. And look, the tide times match up too." Elias was coordinating the signals with legal proceedings. He was building a case, timing the evidence to surface when it would matter most. Nora felt the scope of it expanding, her grandfather not mad, but methodical, working against something larger than a single ship or a single night. This was about control of the shoreline, about money and power and the kind of corruption that moved slowly, legally, behind the facade of proper paperwork. When she returned to her truck that evening, a note was wedged under the windshield wiper, folded once, the paper cheap and rough. The sea kept its dead. Let it, no signature, no threat beyond the words themselves, but the meaning was clear enough. Stop digging, stop asking, walk away while you still can. Nora showed Jonas the note. He read it without expression, then pulled out the deed transfers they had photocopied from the archive. Two names kept appearing in the shell company formations, tucked into the legal language like hidden signatures. One was a lawyer named Holt, Maggie's father, deceased for 10 years. The other was a deputy named Lang, first name Thomas, Sheriff Emmett Lang's father, also deceased. The conspiracy had passed from father to son, generation to generation, the kind of inheritance that bound you not with love, but with complicity. And now Nora had walked into the middle of it, carrying the key to the one room they had never been able to seal completely, because they did not know where Elias had hidden the evidence. "Tonight," Jonas said, reading her thoughts. "We go tonight, or we don't go. At all. They know you're close, they know you have the key. If we wait, they'll find a way to stop us that looks like an accident." Nora nodded, her jaw set, the fear transmuting into something harder and clearer. She had come to Blackpoint for answers about her family. Now she was going to unearth them, whatever they cost. The storm that hit that night was worse than the first, wind hammering the lighthouse so hard the stone seemed to vibrate with each gust. Nora and Jonas descended to the base of the tower, the brass key warm in Nora's hand. The 3 bolts securing the trapdoor resisted, corroded into their housings, but Jonas had brought proper tools, and slowly, methodically, they worked each one free. The trapdoor lifted with a groan of metal and a rush of stale air that smelled of concrete and old electronics. Beneath it a ladder descended into darkness, rungs slick with condensation. Nora went first, her flashlight beam carving a narrow tunnel through the black. The room at the bottom was low and cramped, maybe 10 feet square, with a curved concrete ceiling reinforced with steel beams. "A wartime signal station," Jonas said behind her, his voice echoing strangely. "Used for radio transmissions during the war, then abandoned. Elias must have reactivated it." Against one wall stood a field telephone, its handset hanging dead on the cradle. Metal cabinets lined the opposite wall, and on a small table sat a reel-to-reel tape machine, covered in dust, but still intact. Nora and Jonas set up a portable inverter and powered the machine carefully, the reels beginning to turn with a sound like insect wings. Elias's voice crackled through the speaker, older than Nora had ever known him, but clear and controlled. "This is Captain Elias Whitfield, keeper of Blackpoint Light, recording evidence of criminal conspiracy involving the wreck of the cargo vessel Sea Haven on March 14th. The ship was carrying contraband cigarettes and untaxed liquor, part of a smuggling operation coordinated by Thomas Lang, deputy sheriff, and Martin Holt, county attorney. I have documented their routes, their schedules, their payments. They used the lighthouse signals to guide ships to safe landing points. When I discovered the operation and refused to participate, they used the storm to eliminate both me and the evidence. But I survived long enough to preserve this testimony." The tape ran for 20 minutes, Elias's voice steady and damning, naming names, describing payoffs, explaining how the shorelight had been positioned to guide the Sea Haven onto the rocks when the crew threatened to expose the smuggling route. Another tape contained recordings of conversations, scratchy and distant but audible. Martin Holt and Thomas Lang discussing how to shift beach markers to redraw property lines after the incident, consolidating control of landing points. A third tape was largely corrupted, the magnetic ribbon degraded, but the final section came through clearly. Elias's voice, urgent now, recorded in what must have been his final hours in the lighthouse. 2 accomplices remain active. They will continue the operation under legitimate cover. I have hidden this evidence where only family can find it. If you are hearing this, you have inherited more than property. You have inherited a responsibility to the dead. Nora was reaching for the 4th tape when footsteps sounded above them, heavy boots on the stone floor. She and Jonas froze, looking up at the square of dim light from the tower. The footsteps circled the trapdoor, then stopped directly above them. The trapdoor slammed shut with a metal clang that reverberated through the concrete room. A hasp scraped into place. A lock clicked home. Sheriff Emmett Lang's voice filtered down through the cracks, muffled but unmistakable. This room should have stayed sealed, Miss Whitfield. Some inheritances should be refused. Some histories are better left buried where they can't hurt good people trying to live good lives. Jonas lunged for the ladder, but Nora grabbed his arm, holding him back. The field telephone, she whispered, the wiring. It must connect to something up above, to the relay system. We can use it. They worked by flashlight, tracing cables through conduits in the concrete, finding where the old signal wiring fed up through the walls toward the watchroom. Nora stripped wire with her pocket knife, her hands steady despite the fear hammering in her chest. Jonas rigged connections, jury-rigging the tape machine's output to the relay system, bypassing the crude Morse code mechanism. If we can throw the signal, Nora said, if we can project Elias's voice through the shutter in the watchroom, the whole harbor will hear it. The whole town. Above them, Sheriff Lang's footsteps retreated. They heard the lighthouse door close and lock. He thought he had solved his problem, sealed them away like evidence in a tomb. He did not know they had found the one thing he could never control, a lighthouse designed to broadcast, and a dead man's voice that had waited 40 years to be heard. The wiring took longer than Nora expected, her fingers clumsy with cold and adrenaline as she spliced connections in the dim concrete chamber. Jonas held the flashlight steady, his breathing controlled but shallow, the walls of the sealed room pressing in with each minute that passed. Above them, silence. Sheriff Lang had left them buried, confident that the problem was solved, that the past would stay locked underground where it belonged. Nora twisted the final connection tight and checked the circuit one more time. The tape machine's output now fed directly into the relay system, bypassing the Morse code mechanism entirely. Instead of clicks and patterns, the system would broadcast whatever played through the speakers, amplified and projected through the shutter mechanism in the watchroom. She had no way to know if it would work, if the signal would carry beyond the tower walls, if anyone would hear or care. But she had to try. She threaded the first tape onto the reel, Elias's voice preserved in magnetic rust, and pressed play. Then she threw the relay switches, all of them at once, overriding the safety limits her grandfather had carefully programmed. The system surged to life with a hum that vibrated through the concrete floor. The voice that emerged from the watchroom above was distorted, mechanical, but unmistakably human. Unmistakably her grandfather's. "This is Captain Elias Whitfield, keeper of Blackpoint Light, recording evidence of criminal conspiracy involving the wreck of the cargo vessel Sea Haven on March 14, 1953. The words echoed across the water, carried by the storm wind, amplified by the lighthouse's stone throat. Nora heard it through the walls, through the ceiling, felt it more than heard it, a transmission that turned the entire tower into a speaker broadcasting into the night. In town, windows began to brighten. She could not see them from the sealed room, but she imagined them, lights flicking on in houses, faces appearing at glass. people stepping onto porches to locate the sound. The lighthouse, dark for 40 years, was speaking again. The dead were testifying to Elias's voice continued, methodical and damning, naming Thomas Lang and Martin Holt, describing the smuggling routes, the payoffs, the deliberate murder of 37 crew members to silence witnesses. Jonas stood rigid beside Nora, listening to his own death sentence being read aloud, the truth that had been buried with him for decades. Boats began to appear in the harbor, their running lights cutting through the storm, engines idling, holding position, crews staring up at the lighthouse as the voice rolled over them. The foghorn sounded once, a low acknowledgement, as if the coast itself was bearing witness. Footsteps pounded overhead, rapid and multiple. Voices shouted, muffled by the closed trapdoor. Maggie Holt's voice, sharp with urgency. "Emmett, we need to stop this now. Cut the power. Shut it down before the whole town hears." But Emmett's response was quieter, defeated. "They already hear. Maggie, half the harbor is out there. We can't contain this." The hasp rattled, the lock scraped open, and the trapdoor swung wide. Light flooded down, and Nora shielded her eyes against it. Jonas moved first, surging up the ladder with the kind of desperate strength that comes from 40 years of hiding, of being erased. Nora followed, the tape still playing behind them, Elias's voice continuing its testimony, even as they burst into the base room of the tower. Maggie stood near the door, her face pale and rigid, no longer curating a performance. Emmett was at the base of the spiral stairs, one hand on his belt where his radio should have been, but was not. And between them and the door, a handful of townspeople who had crossed the condemned bridge, despite the storm, despite the warnings drawn by the voice from the lighthouse. Miss Talbot, the quilting widow, Ferris, the old dockhand, the preacher from the church, the hardware store owner who had overcharged Nora for bolt cutters. They stood uncertain, rain-soaked, eyes moving between Nora and the sheriff, and the voice still echoing from above. Nora did not wait for them to speak. She held up one of the tapes, her voice cutting through the storm and her grandfather's recorded testimony. "This is evidence of conspiracy to commit murder, evidence of corruption, that extends from 1953 to today. My grandfather died trying to expose it, and this town has spent 40 years pretending it never happened." Maggie found her voice first, smooth and reasonable despite the panic in her eyes. "Those recordings are fabrications by a man who lost his mind. Elias Whitfield sabotaged the beacon and caused that wreck. Everyone knows it. This is just a desperate attempt to rewrite history, to excuse what he did." Jonas stepped forward into the lamplight, and several people gasped. Ferris dropped the coil of rope he was holding. The preacher made a small sound in his throat, something between recognition and fear. "I'm Jonas Reed," he said quietly. "I was third mate on the Sea Haven. I survived the wreck, and I've been hiding in this town for 38 years because Thomas Lang told me I would disappear if I ever spoke about what happened that night. There were 2 lights. Elias tried to warn us. Someone on shore guided us onto the rock." Emmett moved toward Jonas, his hand dropping to his belt. "You need to stop talking," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "You need to stop this now before you say something you can't take back." But the townsfolk had pressed closer, and Miss Talbot stepped between the sheriff and Jonas, her small frame blocking his path. "Let him speak," she said firmly. "My husband died of guilt for what he saw that night. Let this man speak." Nora pulled out the second tape and held it where everyone could see. "This recording contains conversations between Martin Holt and Thomas Lang discussing how to falsify property records after the wreck, how to consolidate control of the shoreline, how to build a legitimate cover for an illegitimate operation. Their children inherited that conspiracy. Their children are standing here trying to bury it again." More people had gathered outside, crowding the doorway, the bridge behind them swaying with their weight. The storm was breaking, the rain lessening, the wind dropping to a steady push. Elias's voice from the watchroom faded as the first tape reached its end. In the sudden quiet, Nora could hear the ocean, the sound of water against rock, patient and relentless. Maggie's composure finally shattered. "You don't understand what you're destroying," she said, her voice rising. "This town survived because people were willing to let the past stay buried. Because we built something stable on top of the mistakes. You can't just tear it all down for the sake of a truth that helps no one." Nora met her eyes steadily. "Truth always helps someone," she said. "It helps the dead rest, and it helps the living know they're not complicit in silence." Jonas climbed the spiral stairs toward the watchroom, moving with purpose. Nora followed, and the crowd followed them, a slow procession up the narrow steps. Emmett tried to push through, to stop them, but hands held him back. Townspeople who had lived with the weight of unspoken things, finally choosing to see what had been sealed away. At the watchroom, Nora loaded the second tape and let it play, the voices of the fathers echoing through the space, damning their children with every word. And then she pointed to the ceiling, to the final barrier. "The lantern room," she said. "That's where Elias kept the rest. That's what needs to be opened." The preacher's son, a young man with carpenter's hands, pulled a pry bar from his belt. "With your permission," he said to Nora. She nodded, and he began working at the riveted steel plate that had sealed the lantern room for 40 years. The lantern room seal came away in sections, metal screaming as rivets popped free. The crowd pressed close on the spiral stairs, bodies filling the watchroom and spilling down toward the keeper's quarters. Lighting still flickered on the horizon, illuminating faces in brief, stark flashes. The lighthouse had become a courtroom, impromptu and ancient, the kind of tribunal that forms when official channels have been corrupted beyond repair. Nora and Jonas hauled themselves up through the opening into the lantern room. The space was smaller than Nora expected, circular and glass-walled, open to the night sky where the beacon housing had been removed decades ago. Rain spattered through the gaps, and the floor was littered with debris, bird nests and rust. But in the center, protected by a metal footlocker chained to a floor bolt, was what Elias had preserved. Jonas broke the lock with the pry bar, and Nora lifted the lid. Inside were documents in waterproof sheeting, photographs, ledgers with entries in her grandfather's precise hand, and one more tape, labeled in red marker, "Final Testimony." She descended carefully with the footlocker, passing it down to waiting hands, and the contents were spread across the watchroom floor, like evidence at a crime scene. The preacher picked up a photograph, his face going pale. "This is my father," he said quietly, standing on the dock with Thomas Lang. "I remember this. I was 7 years old. One of the fishermen found a ledger page listing payment amounts and dates. 'These are boat registrations,' he said. 'These are our boats. Our father's boats. They were all involved.' A woman Nora did not know opened a document and began to read aloud, her voice shaking. It was a list of everyone who had benefited from the property redistribution after the wreck. Everyone who had received parcels of shoreline for pennies on the dollar. Everyone who had built their current prosperity on the bones of the Sea Haven crew. The room fell silent as the weight of complicity settled over them. This was not a simple story of two corrupt officials and a brave whistleblower. This was a town that had participated, actively or passively, in burying the truth. This was collective guilt, inherited and maintained across generations. Emmett Lang tried one more time to assert authority. "These documents don't prove anything," he said, his voice strained. "This is just the paranoid record of a disturbed man. We need to turn this over to proper authorities, to people who can evaluate it objectively." Mrs. Talbot rounded on him. "Your father was the proper authority, and he was a murderer. You've spent your career protecting his crimes. We don't need your kind of objectivity." Nora loaded the final tape, Elias's last words, recorded in the hours before he vanished. His voice was different now, exhausted, afraid, but still determined. "If you're hearing this, then I'm gone. And you have all the evidence I could gather. I tried to do this through official channels. I went to the county attorney and found he was complicit. I went to the state police and learned the corruption ran deeper than I imagined. So I'm leaving this for whoever comes after, for whoever inherits this lighthouse and this responsibility. The sea took 37 souls because greedy men valued profit over life. Don't let their deaths mean nothing. Don't let the silence continue. Speak for those who can't speak for themselves. The tape hissed to silence, and in that quiet, something shifted in the room. The anger that had been building, the defensive posturing, the attempts to contain and control, all of it fell away. What remained was exhaustion and shame and a kind of terrible clarity. Maggie Holt sank onto the spiral stairs, her head in her hands. "My father made me promise," she said, her voice muffled. "Made me promise to protect his legacy, to keep the town stable. I thought I was honoring him. I thought I was doing the right thing." "You were protecting his crimes," Jonas said, not unkindly, "and asking everyone else to carry that weight with you." Emmett reached for his badge, his movements slow and deliberate, but the hardware store owner stepped forward and took it from his belt before he could remove it himself. "I'll hold this," the man said, "until we figure out what kind of law enforcement this town actually needs." The young carpenter, who had opened the lantern room seal, climbed back up into the space, and Nora heard him moving around above them. "What are you doing?" she called up. Bearing witness, he called back. He reappeared at the opening, holding a bundle of wire and a work lamp. "If this lighthouse is going to speak truth, it needs light. Real light, not hidden signals and secret messages. Something everyone can see." Others joined him, passing up tools, climbing into the lantern room, working together to rig a temporary beacon using the work lamp and a makeshift reflector hammered from sheet metal someone had brought. It was crude, nothing like the original Fresnel lens, but when they powered it on, the beam swept across the harbor in a slow, steady rotation. Not a distress signal, not a warning, a declaration. "We see, we know, we choose to remember." The storm passed before dawn, leaving the skies scrubbed clean and pale. Nora stood in the lantern room as the sun rose, watching the beam of the makeshift beacon fade in the growing light. The townspeople had stayed through the night, some sleeping in the keeper's quarters, others keeping vigil in the watchroom, all of them processing what they had learned and what it meant for their understanding of themselves and their home. By mid-morning, a delegation had formed. The preacher, Mrs. Talbot, Ferris, the hardware store owner, and a dozen others. They gathered in the base room and made a decision without any official authority, but with complete moral clarity. They would escort Nora, Jonas, and all the evidence to the State Attorney General's office in Portland. They would testify about what they had found and what their town had hidden. They would do this publicly, with no backroom deals, no sealed records, no quiet resolutions that left the truth buried. Maggie Holt was taken into custody, not by law enforcement, but by the community itself. The preacher's wife and 2 other women volunteered to stay with her, not as guards, but as witnesses, ensuring she did not disappear or harm herself. It was a strange kind of imprisonment, provisional and improvised, but it held. Emmett Lang surrendered without resistance, and the hardware store owner locked him in the town's small holding cell, a 2-room structure behind the municipal building that had not been used in years. Someone would need to call the state police eventually, but for now the town was managing its own reckoning. In the weeks that followed, investigators came from Portland, then from Boston, then from Washington as the scope of the corruption became clear. The Sea Haven case Rio property records were audited. Decades of carefully maintained lies unraveled under scrutiny. Some people in Blackpoint were implicated and faced charges. Others were exonerated. The town fractured and reformed, the social fabric tearing and being stitched back together in new patterns. Jonas Reed reclaimed his name publicly, and the state issued an official apology for his 40-year exile. He testified at trial with a clarity that came from finally being allowed to speak, from no longer having to hide or apologize for having survived. The nightmares did not go away, but they changed, becoming memories he could carry instead of weights that dragged him down. Nora stayed in Blackpoint through it all, living in the lighthouse keeper's quarters, maintaining the temporary beacon, answering questions from investigators and journalists and historians who wanted to understand how a single man's attempt to expose corruption had been silenced for so long. She spoke at hearings, provided documents, and refused every attempt to simplify the story into heroes and villains. The truth was more complicated than that, more human, more painful. The lighthouse itself became the center of the town's transformation. A community vote, held in the aftermath of the trials, determined that the structure would be restored not as a navigational aid, but as what they called a civic signal house, a place dedicated to transparency and accountability. The beacon mechanism was rebuilt, modernized, and set to shine every evening as the sun set, not to guide ships but to remind the living of their obligation to truth. A memorial plaque was installed at the base of the tower, listing the names of the 37 crew members who had died in the wreck of the Sea Haven. Their families, scattered across the country, were invited to a dedication ceremony. Some came, some could not bear to. All of them received letters from the town of Blackpoint, formal apologies that acknowledged decades of silence and complicity. Jonas took responsibility for maintaining the signal system, the one Elias had built, and that had finally, after 40 years, been heard. He repurposed the relay mechanism to ring a small bell mounted in the lantern room, and on clear nights, he would activate it and read the names aloud, each one carried on the salt wind, each one remembered. Nora recorded her final entry on the microcassette recorder, 6 months after that first night when she had heard the Morse code through the fog. She stood in the watchroom, the same room where her grandfather had kept vigil, where he had documented corruption and prepared his testimony and ultimately given his life for truth. "This is Nora Whitfield, keeper of Blackpoint Light," she said into the small microphone. "I inherited a structure I didn't understand and a history I didn't ask for. What I learned was that inheritance is not just about property, it's about responsibility. My grandfather tried to speak for the dead, and he was silenced, but he left evidence, left a signal, left a way for the truth to surface, even after he was gone. That's what a lighthouse does. It marks the dangerous places. It warns about the rocks that lie hidden. It calls out in the darkness so others can find their way." She paused, looking out through the salt-stained windows at the town spread below, at the harbor where boats rocked at anchor, at the bridge that had been repaired and reinforced so people could come and go freely. "This light will keep burning," she continued, "not as a warning to ships, but as a promise to the living, a promise that we will not forget, that we will not allow silence to cover crimes, that we will bear witness even when it's uncomfortable, even when it costs us our comfortable stories about who we are. The sea keeps its dead, but the living have to keep the truth." She clicked off the recorder and set it on the desk beside Elias's old logbooks, now archived and preserved. Outside, the sun was setting, and the beacon began its slow rotation, light sweeping across the water in steady, patient intervals. Jonas appeared at the top of the spiral stairs, carrying 2 mugs of coffee, his face weathered, but no longer haunted. "Storm's coming in tomorrow," he said, handing her a mug. "Big one, they say. The beacon will hold." Nora nodded, wrapping her hands around the warmth. "It always does." They stood together in the watchroom as the light turned, as the bell chimed once for each name, as the town below settled into evening. The lighthouse had been silent for 40 years, but now it spoke every night, and people had learned to listen. Some inheritances were burdens, others were callings. Nora had not asked for this responsibility, but she had claimed it, and in doing so had found a way to honor the dead and serve the living. The beam swept past them, steady and true, a light that remained. Up next, we have two more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch, and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.